Evelyn Marlowe threw the letter onto her brother's desk and said, "You sold me." Charles flinched, the candle between them trembled. "It wasn't like that. You signed my name to a debt settlement without my knowledge." Her voice didn't shake. That surprised even her. "Lord Whitlock gets the estate. You get your debts cleared, and I get handed over like a parcel of land nobody wanted to keep." She picked up her traveling case. "I found every document, Charles, every single one." She walked out the door before he could answer. Tonight she would sit beside the most feared man in the county. And she would do it on purpose. If this story moves something in you, please subscribe to our channel and follow Evelyn all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The ballroom at Blackthorn Hall had 47 people in it the night Evelyn Marlowe walked through the front door with a letter in her traveling case and a decision already made. She had counted the guests twice, once from the doorway, once from the edge of the receiving room, because counting was how she managed the kind of feeling that had been sitting in her chest since 2 o'clock that afternoon, when she pulled a folded page from between two ledger books in her brother's study and read her own future being sold in another man's handwriting. The feeling was not grief. She had expected grief. What she felt instead was something quieter and considerably more dangerous, the specific stillness of a woman who has just understood that patience, practiced long enough, becomes its own kind of trap. She accepted a glass of something from a passing tray. She did not drink it. She moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms along the edges. Without announcement, slipping between conversations, without being drawn into them. Seen without being noticed. It was a skill she had refined over 32 years of being the unremarkable Marlowe sister. And she was very good at it. Tonight she intended to use it differently. She was looking for the empty chair. She found it at the far end of the long dining table. And she understood immediately why it was empty. Duke Adrian Holloway sat beside it. She had never spoken to him directly. She had seen him twice at county gatherings, once at the Aldermore Harvest Supper 18 months ago. Once at a land commission meeting she had attended in her brother's place, because Charles had a previous engagement that turned out to be a card game. Both times the Duke had occupied a particular kind of space, not the space of a man who demanded deference, but the space of a man around whom deference formed automatically. The way water moves around stone. He was not doing anything remarkable now. He was simply sitting, straight-backed still, with a glass of wine at his right hand and an expression that suggested he found the evening mildly insufficient. The chairs around him were populated on the far end and entirely vacant on the near side, as though the table itself had developed an opinion about proximity. 3 women standing near the east wall had clearly identified the empty chair and clearly rejected it. Evelyn saw Mrs. Hargrove catch her eye and perform a small, firm headshake, the kind of warning passed between women who have learned that certain choices carry social consequences that fall entirely on the woman who made them. Evelyn looked at the empty chair. She looked at the letter she could feel through the leather of her traveling case. She walked to the chair and sat down. The room didn't go silent all at once. It went silent in a wave starting at the nearest tables, spreading outward, reaching the musicians in the far corner who did not stop playing but did, somehow, play more quietly, as though the room had decided it needed to hear what happened next. Duke Holloway turned his head and looked at her. His eyes were gray. Not the gray of overcast skies or faded things, the gray of early morning light over flat land, when the world has color but hasn't committed to it yet. He looked at her the way she imagined. He looked at balance sheets and boundary disputes and other matters requiring precise assessment directly, without social decoration, waiting for information. "You are aware," he said, "of who you are sitting beside." His voice was low. It did not perform itself. "Yes, Your Grace," she said. "And you chose this chair regardless. There were no others." He glanced along the table at the standing women, at the empty chairs on the opposite end, at the small geography of avoidance that had formed around him over the course of the evening. Something shifted in his expression. Not amusement exactly. The shadow of it. There are women standing along the east wall, he said, who appear to prefer the floor. I noticed, Evelyn said. I've been standing all evening. I find I'm finished with it. He held her gaze for 3 seconds. 4. Long enough that the nearest guests noticed they were looking at each other and went carefully back to their own conversations. Then the Duke turned back to the table, picked up his wine glass for the first time, and said nothing further. She took that to mean the topic was closed. She was wrong. The dinner conversation assembled itself around them with the cautious energy of people who have witnessed something unexpected and are not yet sure what to do with it. Evelyn had participated in enough of these gatherings to know the rhythms, the opening bids, the careful positioning, the way status moved through a room like water finding level. She was listening to a Mr. Farrow to her left explain, at considerable length, his views on the current wool market. When the Duke said, without inflection, "Farrow is wrong about the Pemberton margin," she turned. He was looking at the table, not at her, not at Farrow. "The Pemberton agreement," she said. "He's citing the original valuation. It was renegotiated in March. The current figures are considerably lower than what he's suggesting. Mr. Farrow's expression arranged itself into injured dignity. Across the table, 2 gentlemen set down their glasses. "Your Grace," one of them said carefully, "the Pemberton agreement was broadly considered favorable to the people who drafted it," the Duke said. "Less so to the tenants who depended on it." He finally looked up. "I revised the terms, some would say overly so. Some had financial stakes in the original structure." He set his glass down. Their opinion was noted. The table shifted. Evelyn watched it happen, the small adjustments of posture, the diplomatic clearing of throats, the way certain faces went carefully neutral. She had watched Whitlock manage rooms like this dozens of times, and the difference was precise. Whitlock smiled while he did it. The Duke simply stated what was true and let the room decide what to do with the discomfort. She found she strongly preferred the latter. "You know the Pemberton revision," she said. Not a question. He looked at her again, that direct, assessing look. "I drafted it. You're familiar with the terms? My brother's estate has 3 tenant parcels adjacent to the Pemberton land. The revised boundary calculations affected our eastern acreage." She paused. "I recalculated the surveys in April." A silence landed between them that had a different quality than the surrounding dinner noise. He was looking at her with something that was not quite surprise, and was not quite its absence. "You recalculated the boundary surveys," he said. "Our estate manager reads contracts the way most men read instruction manuals, convinced he understands them without checking." She said it evenly. "Because it was simply accurate. Someone had to verify the figures. And your brother, my brother, delegates the details." She felt him take the full measure of what she was not saying. The specific architecture of it, the competence that went unnamed, the labor that went unattributed, the way an entire estate could function smoothly for years, because one unremarkable woman had made herself responsible for all the parts no one else wanted to manage. He was quiet for a moment. "What do you do with the surveys once you've recalculated them?" he asked. "I file them, I implement the corrections, I record the outcomes, and then I determine what needs doing next." "Does your brother understand the scope of what you manage?" It was a blunt question. She appreciated its bluntness, even as she registered that answering it honestly would say more about her circumstances than she typically allowed. "He understands the outcomes," she said. "The mechanisms don't interest him." The Duke looked at her with those steady gray eyes, and she had the clear impression that he was doing the same thing she did with financial documents, reading past the presented summary to the actual figures underneath. "I see," he said. He said nothing else. But he did not look away immediately either. And she noticed, because she noticed everything, that this was the first conversation she had been in all evening, where the other person had asked her a question they actually wanted the answer to. Whitlock found her after dinner. She had positioned herself near the far window of the drawing room deliberately. with sightlines to both doors, because she'd spent the last 3 hours preparing for exactly this conversation, and she intended to have it on her own terms rather than his. He appeared at her elbow with 2 glasses and a smile calibrated to be disarming. "Miss Marlowe." He offered one of the glasses. "You look as though the evening has been trying." She did not take the glass. "Lord Whitlock." Something moved through his expression. Controlled. "I'd hoped for a private word, I imagine you had." He shifted slightly, positioning himself between her and the nearest cluster of guests. Not quite blocking. Not quite not blocking. The geometry of a man accustomed to controlling the dimensions of a conversation without appearing to. "Your brother and I have been discussing certain arrangements," he said. "Matters that involve you quite directly." "I know what you've arranged," she said. He stopped. The smile held, but its foundation shifted. She could see it. The way a well-constructed expression can absorb a surprise without vanishing, but still register the impact. "I see," he said carefully. "I found the letter this afternoon." She looked at him without flinching. "The one describing the terms. The one specifying that I need not be informed beforehand because women of my disposition accept what is decided for them." Whitlock was quiet for 3 seconds. "Miss Marlowe," he said, and his voice had changed, not threatening. Not yet, but with an undertone now that hadn't been present before. Something that suggested he was recalculating. "You must understand that your brother was in a difficult position. The debt required resolution. The arrangement I proposed was generous. You attached a promissory note to the secondary parcel," she said. "A lien that would give you effective control of the northern acreage within 5 years. Independent of whether the primary debt is cleared." She said it quietly. The way she said everything, without heat, without performance. "That is not a generous arrangement. That is a mechanism for acquiring land at a fraction of its value by using a woman as the instrument of transfer." The smile was gone. In its place was something considerably more honest, a look of assessment, of recalibration, of a man deciding how to handle a variable that had not appeared in his calculations. "You have been busy," he said softly. "I've been thorough," she corrected. "There's a difference. Busy suggests urgency. I've been thorough for 3 months. His eyes were steady on hers. "Those are private documents. County land records are public record. The promissory note is registered with the county clerk. Anyone who knows to look for it can find it." She paused. "I knew to look." "And what?" he said, very quietly. "Do you intend to do with what you've found?" She met his gaze with the full stillness of someone who has already decided and is only now allowing the other person to understand that the decision has been made. "I intend," she said, "to have a conversation with witnesses present. Tomorrow, with my brother in the room and the documents on the table." She held his gaze 1 beat longer than was comfortable. "I'd suggest you prepare accordingly." She excused herself before he could respond and moved back toward the main hall. And she did not let herself feel the full weight of what she'd just done until she rounded the corner into the empty corridor, stood alone for 30 seconds in the dark, her back against the wall and her hands pressed flat against the plaster. Her heart was going considerably faster than she would have preferred. But her hands were steady. She pushed off the wall and kept walking. The Duke was in the entry hall, coat in hand, preparing to leave ahead of the party's conclusion, which she suspected was a pattern rather than an exception. He stood to one side of the front door with the settled quality of a man who had fulfilled whatever obligation had brought him here and was now preparing to return to a life he found more worthwhile. He saw her coming and didn't pretend otherwise. "Miss Marlowe, Your Grace." She stopped 3 feet from him, near enough for conversation, far enough for decorum. "I need to ask something of you directly. And I apologize in advance for the abruptness." He waited. She was beginning to understand, a man who was very good at waiting. "I have documentation of financial misconduct," she said. "Specific, organized, verifiable documentation. I need a witness, someone with no financial stake in the Whitlock arrangement, and enough standing that their presence at a conversation cannot be dismissed or managed." She paused. I need someone Whitlock cannot buy. Something changed in his expression. What makes you certain I can't be bought? He asked. You revised the Pemberton Agreement at significant personal cost to your own relationships within this county, she said. You've been socially managed and financially pressured for 2 years, and you haven't adjusted your position. She met his eyes. Men who can be bought adjust their positions. The stillness around him deepened. She could not have said whether this meant she had said something correct or something objectionable. She waited, the way he waited, without filling the silence with reassurance. What do you need from me specifically? Your presence. Tomorrow morning, at Marlowe House, when I present the documentation to my brother and to Whitlock. She paused. I will manage the conversation myself. I only need someone in the room who cannot be removed from it. You want a witness. Not an advocate. Yes, he considered her for a moment. And if the documentation is insufficient? It isn't, she said simply. Something crossed his face, brief, unreadable, gone before she could name it. He looked at her, the way he'd looked at her across the dinner table when she'd mentioned the boundary surveys, with that same quality of precise, undecorated attention. Marlowe House, he said. 9 o'clock, she agreed. He nodded once, the economy of a man who does not use gestures he doesn't mean, and moved through the front door. She stood in the entry hall and listened to his footsteps on the stone outside and the sound of a carriage being called, and she let herself feel, for exactly 1 moment, the specific and unfamiliar sensation of having asked for help and received it without condition. Then she went to retrieve her traveling case. The carriage home was silent. Charles sat across from her with a glass still in his hand and the soft, unfocused expression of a man who had drunk enough to feel generous toward himself. He did not ask her how the evening had gone. He glanced at her once, registered her presence, registered her containment, and turned to the window with the ease of someone who has never once wondered whether the people around him were all right. He said, just before the gates of Marlowe House came into view, Whitlock was pleased with how you presented tonight. He mentioned it to me. Evelyn looked at her brother. In the dark of the carriage, with the gate lanterns throwing uneven light across his face, he looked exactly like what he was, a man who had made a decision about someone else's life and was waiting comfortably for her to cooperate with it. Charles, she said, I found the letter. The glass stopped halfway to his mouth. The one between the ledgers, in your study, she kept voice entirely level. I've read it. I understand the terms. I understand the promissory note attached to the secondary parcel. I understand what you've agreed to give Whitlock and what you expect me to accept in exchange. He set the glass down. Evelyn, don't. The word was quiet and completely final. Don't explain it to me as though I'm upset because I've misunderstood something. I understand exactly. She looked out the window. I've spent 10 years managing this estate. I've cleared 3 separate crises you never knew about because I resolved them before they reached you. I know every debt, every agreement, every dependency we carry. She turned back to him. I am not a parcel of land, Charles. I am the reason there is still land to sell. The carriage stopped. Neither of them moved immediately. You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, she said, to decide whether you want to be part of the solution or the problem that requires solving. She reached for the door handle. I would encourage you to choose carefully. She stepped out of the carriage without waiting for his hand. She worked until 2:30 in the morning. The documents were already organized. They had been organized for 3 months. In the quiet way she organized everything, methodically and without announcement, building a record she had hoped she would never need to use. She went through them now with a different purpose, arranging not just the evidence but the sequence of its presentation, the order that would make the case clearest, the documentation that would be hardest to dismiss, the specific language in the promissory note that established intent rather than merely opportunity. She was not building an argument. She was building a record. There was a difference. Arguments could be countered. Record simply existed. When she finally set down her pen, the candle had burned to a third of its original height, and the house was entirely silent around her. She sat for a moment in the quiet, looking at the assembled papers, the letter, the promissory note, the boundary surveys, the ledger extracts. The 3 months of careful, patient documentations spread across a writing desk in a room that no one else ever entered. She thought about the Duke saying 9 o'clock with the clean economy of a man who meant what he said. She thought about Whitlock's face when she told him she'd been thorough for 3 months. She thought about Charles in the carriage, the glass stopped halfway to his mouth. She blew out the candle and went to bed in the dark. She was not afraid. That, she thought, was the part that surprised her most. She had expected fear. She had carried it for 3 months. The low, persistent hum of it, underneath everything, the knowledge of what she'd found. The awareness of what it meant, the understanding that acting on it would change things in ways she could not entirely predict. But sitting here, on the other side of the decision, with the documents stacked and the witness confirmed, and the conversation scheduled for 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, she was not afraid. She was ready, and that was the first time in 32 years that she had felt exactly that. She was awake before the sun, not because she had slept poorly, she had slept with the specific, flat efficiency of someone whose body understood that rest was a practical requirement rather than a comfort, but because there was work to do before 9 o'clock. And Evelyn Marlowe had never in her life waited for circumstances to arrive when she could spend the intervening time preparing for them. She dressed without calling for assistance. She had the documents arranged in order of presentation before the household stirred. She was at the breakfast table with tea and the estate ledgers when Mrs. Connolly, the housekeeper, came downstairs and stopped in the doorway with the expression of a woman who has worked for a family long enough to recognize when something is different. "Miss Evelyn," Mrs. Connolly said carefully. "You're up early." "I have a meeting at 9, Evelyn said. "Is my brother awake?" "I haven't heard him, miss." "Wake him at 7:30. "Tell him it's necessary." She turned a page in the ledger without looking up. "And Mrs. Connolly will need the front sitting room prepared. 3 chairs at the writing table. The good ones, Mrs." Connolly was quiet for a moment. "Are we expecting guests?" "We are expecting Lord Whitlock and Duke Holloway." She looked up then. Briefly, "Please make certain the tea is strong. It's going to be a long morning, Mrs." Connolly left without further questions. She was a woman who had worked at Marlowe House for 19 years. And she had learned early that when Evelyn said a thing plainly, she meant it completely, and that asking for elaboration was rarely more useful than simply doing what was asked. Evelyn turned back to the ledgers and kept working. At 7:45, she heard Charles's footsteps on the stairs, heavier than usual. Slower, with the particular reluctant quality of a man who knows the morning holds something he would rather not face. She heard him stop outside the sitting room door. She heard him breathe. Then he came in. He looked like a man who had not slept. There were shadows under his eyes and a tightness around his mouth. And he was holding a cup of tea with both hands, the way people held things when they needed something to hold. "Evelyn," he said. "Charles." She did not look up from the document she was reviewing. "Sit down. I want to explain." "You can explain at 9 o'clock, she said. "Right now I need you to look at these." She pushed 2 pages across the table toward him, the estate ledgers. "Open to the accounts for the past 18 months. Tell me what you see." He sat. He looked at the pages with the slightly unfocused attention of a man who has never learned to read a ledger the way it needs to be read, skimming the surface of numbers without following their logic. "The accounts," he said. "The accounts," she agreed. "Specifically the accounts as they actually are, rather than as you've been presenting them." She leaned forward and set her finger on a line item. "This entry, what does it represent to you?" He squinted. "The harvest yields from the northern parcels." "Correct." "And this one?" "Third quarter." "Also correct." "And this one?" He looked. He looked for longer than the first 2. I'm not certain. That, Evelyn said, is the emergency repair fund I built over 4 years by redirecting a portion of the household operational surplus each quarter. She watched his face. The fund I used 18 months ago, when the North Barn Foundation failed. The fund that prevented you from needing to take out a secondary loan that would have collapsed our credit position entirely. She paused. You signed the paperwork. Do you remember what you thought it was for? He was quiet. You told me it was a routine maintenance expense, he said finally. A statement, not an accusation. He was beginning to understand something. She could see it not in a flash, but slowly, the way a man understands a thing he has been successfully not understanding for a very long time. It was, she said, routine because I made certain it was handled before it became a crisis. She pulled the pages back toward her. Charles, I need you to understand something before 9 o'clock. I am not angry because you made a decision about my future without asking me. That is a different conversation, and we will have it. What I need you to understand right now is that the arrangement you made with Whitlock is not simply unfair to me. It is a trap for you. He looked up. The promissory note, she said. Did he show it to you directly? There were a number of documents. Did he show it to you and explain it? Charles set down his teacup. He summarized the main terms. He summarized the terms that benefited you, Evelyn said. The promissory note attached to the secondary parcel was not in the summary. It gives him a lien against the northern acreage that activates independently of the primary debt resolution, meaning that even if the debt is cleared, he retains legal claim to the land. She held her brother's gaze. He wasn't purchasing a wife, Charles. He was purchasing the estate. You were the mechanism. The silence in the room was complete. Charles sat across from her, with his tea gone cold, and his face doing something complicated, and private, the expression of a man confronting the distance between what he believed he understood and what was actually true. She had seen that expression before, in other forms, but never on her brother's face directed at her. How long, he said slowly. Have you known about the note? 3 months. 3 months. He repeated it the way people repeated things they needed time to absorb. And you said nothing. I was still compiling the documentation, she said. I needed the full picture before I said anything. Because a partial accusation against a man like Whitlock is worse than silence. She looked at her brother steadily. I needed to be certain. I am certain now. He put his face in his hands. Not dramatically, just tiredly, the gesture of a man who has run out of the energy required to maintain a position. What do you need from me this morning? He said through his hands. I need you to sit at that table and listen, she said. I need you to not speak unless I ask you to speak. And I need you to trust for once that I know what I'm doing. She paused. Can you do that? He lowered his hands. He really looked at her. With the full attention he had never quite managed to direct at her in 32 years of shared living. And she could see the precise moment he recognized what he was looking at. Yes, he said quietly, I can do that. The clock on the mantel read 8:43. Duke Holloway arrived at 9 o'clock exactly. She heard the carriage on the drive and was at the front door before Mrs. Connolly reached it, not because she was anxious, but because she had learned long ago that the first moment of a difficult meeting set its entire tone, and she intended to set this one herself. He stepped out of the carriage and looked at the house with the same quality of direct, undecorated assessment he directed at everything. He was dressed plainly for a Duke dark coat. No embellishment, the clothes of a man who had stopped using appearance as argument some time ago. He carried nothing. He saw her in the doorway and came directly toward her, without the social preamble. Most men would have produced the comment on the weather, the pleasantry about the morning, the performance of ease. Miss Marlowe, he said. Your Grace, thank you for coming. She stepped back to let him in. We have perhaps 20 minutes before Whitlock arrives. I'd like to use them. He followed her through the hall and into the sitting room without comment. Charles stood when he entered, a reflex of rank, awkward given the circumstances. The Duke acknowledged him with a nod and then turned to Evelyn. "Show me the documentation," he said. She spread it on the table in the order she had arranged it that morning, the letter first, then the promissory note, then the ledger extracts, then the boundary survey corrections, then county records she had obtained 3 months ago and cross-referenced against Whitlock's own property filings. He read without speaking. She stood back and let him read. Because she had learned that people who read carefully did not benefit from being narrated at. And because she could tell within 30 seconds of watching him move through the pages that he read the way she read, not skimming for headlines, but following the logic, checking the figures, registering where the language shifted from precise to vague, and understanding why. He was on the promissory note when he stopped. "He registered this with the county clerk," he said. "Not a question. 6 weeks before he approached my brother," she said. He looked up. He'd already filed it. He filed the lien before he proposed the arrangement. The arrangement was the mechanism for activating it. My marriage would have transferred a portion of my inheritance rights, which under the current estate structure would have made the lien enforceable. She paused. Without the marriage, the lien is technically registered, but not yet triggered. It's an illegal intermediate state, which means it can be challenged. She agreed. If challenged before the marriage takes place, in front of the right authority. With this documentation presented correctly, he set the promissory note down and looked at the boundary surveys. "These recalculations," he said. "You did these yourself. In April, they're accurate. I had them verified by the county surveyor." Unofficially, she had not planned to say that. She said it because he was reading her documents the way they deserved to be read. And she found she wanted him to know they were correct. He confirmed the figures. Duke Holloway looked at her across the table. "Miss Marlowe," he said, "how long have you been managing this estate?" 10 years, she said. "Since my father's health declined. And in 10 years, has anyone, your brother, your father, anyone acknowledged that to you formally?" The question landed in the room and stayed there. She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "But that's not asking to make a point," he said. "I'm asking because it's relevant to how Whitlock will attempt to dismiss your documentation this morning. He will not attack the documents directly, they're too well organized for direct attack. He will attack your credibility. He will suggest that a woman who has operated without formal authority has no standing to present financial evidence." He held her gaze. "I want to know what you have that establishes your authority before he makes that argument." She stared at him. Not because the question surprised her, because she had already thought of this. At 1 a.m, with the candle burning low, and had already found the answer, and the fact that he had arrived at the same question in 4 minutes of reading told her something about the precision of how he thought. "I have counter-signature authority on the estate accounts," she said. "My father added me to the account registration when he became ill. It was never changed after his death because," she paused. "Because no one thought to change it. Because no one was paying attention." The corner of his mouth moved. The shadow of something. "They weren't paying attention," he said. "They never were," she said. "It's the thing that's going to cost them this morning." Before he could respond, they heard a carriage on the drive. Whitlock. He came in the way powerful men entered rooms they considered already won, with the particular ease of someone who has decided the outcome in advance and is simply waiting for the other participants to confirm it. He had a composed smile and a leather document case and a manner so calibrated to confidence that it read, on the surface, as generosity. He stopped when he saw the Duke. Just for a moment. Just long enough for Evelyn to see the recalculation happen behind his eyes. "Your Grace," he said. "Immediate. I wasn't aware you'd be joining us. Miss Marlowe invited me," the Duke said. Whitlock looked at Evelyn. The smile held, but something behind it had gone cold and alert. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "You've been busy this morning." "I've been thorough," she said. "Sit down, Lord Whitlock." He sat. He set his document case on the table with deliberate care. and she noticed that his hands did not betray him. Lord Whitlock had excellent hands. The kind that stayed steady, regardless of what the rest of him was doing. She noted it the way she noted everything, cleanly, without judgment, as information. "I've asked you here," she said, "to discuss the terms of the arrangement you made with my brother." "I'm glad to discuss it," Whitlock said pleasantly. "In fact, I think once the full terms are understood—" "I understand the full terms," Evelyn said. "Including the promissory note, registered with the key clerk 6 weeks before you approached my brother." The room went very quiet. Whitlock looked at her for 3 seconds without speaking. She counted. 3 seconds was a long time for a man like him to have nothing to say. And she could see him deciding in real time which version of himself this situation required. He chose reason. She had expected he would try reason first. "The promissory note is a standard financial instrument," he said carefully. "It protects my interests in the event the primary arrangement is not fulfilled. It creates a lien against the northern acreage that would give you control of the land independent of the debt settlement," she said. "It was not disclosed to my brother as part of the proposed terms. It was included in the documentation." "It was included," Charles said suddenly. "From his chair at the side of the table, in a supplementary document that you told me was standard boilerplate." Whitlock looked at him. Charles looked back with the expression of a man who has just fully arrived at understanding something and is not enjoying the arrival. "You told me it was standard," Charles said again. His voice was steady. She had not been certain this morning that he would be steady. She was grateful for it. "There may have been some lack of clarity in how the document was presented," Whitlock said. "That can be addressed." "By doing what exactly?" Evelyn said. He turned back to her, "By renegotiating the terms. If there are elements of the arrangement that concern you, I'm entirely open to Lord Whitlock." She set her hand flat on the promissory note. On the table between them, "This document, as registered, is not a negotiating position. It is a legal instrument that you filed with clear intent before any arrangement was proposed to my family. The intent was to use the marriage as a mechanism to trigger a lien you had already established." She met his gaze. "I am not here to renegotiate. I am here to inform you that my family will not be proceeding with the arrangement. That I will be filing a formal challenge to the lien with the County Land Commission. And that Duke Holloway has agreed to serve as witness to this conversation." Whitlock went very still. His eyes moved to the Duke. Something passed between them, not words, not gesture, but the specific communication of two men who have navigated power long enough to read its movements precisely. "You understand," Whitlock said to the Duke, his voice dropping into a register that was not quite a threat but occupied the same territory. "That there are a number of matters in this county in which your interests and mine have historically overlapped." "I do understand that," the Duke said. "And that a dispute of this nature could complicate." "It won't complicate my position," the Duke said. "I don't have the kind of position that complicates." He said it without heat, without performance, simply as fact. "You're thinking of the arrangement you tried to propose to me 2 years ago regarding the Pemberton land." "I declined then. My answer hasn't changed." The color in Whitlock's face shifted. "You declined," he said, "and look what it cost you." "It cost me the opinions of men whose opinions I don't need," the Duke said. "And it preserved the accuracy of my accounting records, which I find considerably more valuable." Evelyn looked at the Duke. He had not told her about Whitlock approaching him. He had not told her because she had not asked, and she filed the information now 2 years ago. Same man, same method, different target, same outcome. Whitlock collected leverage. He had been doing it longer than she knew. She turned back to Whitlock. "The challenge will be filed this week," she said. "You'll receive formal notice from the county clerk's office. At that point, this becomes a matter for the Land Commission rather than a private conversation." She gathered the documents from the table calmly, methodically, in the same order she had laid them out. "I want to thank you for coming this morning. It wasn't required. And I appreciate that you did. The pleasantness of it, the genuine, Unperformed courtesy seemed to affect him more than the confrontation had. He stared at her. "You're thanking me," he said. "You came when asked," she said. "That matters." She set the documents in their case. "I'd encourage you not to challenge the filing, Lord Whitlock. The documentation is thorough, and a formal proceeding would make the details of the promissory note a matter of public record." She let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. "Good day," she said. He left without another word. Not because he had no words she suspected Lord Whitlock always had words, but because the words available to him in this particular moment would have revealed something he was not prepared to reveal. And he was too experienced a man to speak when silence was the more strategic choice. The carriage rolled away from Marlowe House, and the sitting room went quiet, with a different quality of quiet than it had held during the conversation lighter. Somehow, as though the room had been holding its breath. Charles let out a long, unsteady exhale. God. Evelyn set the document case on the table and sat down for the first time since the meeting began. She was aware of the Duke still present at the far end of the table, watching her with that steady, attending quality, and she was aware that her hands, now that the conversation was over, wanted very badly to shake. And she was not going to allow that. "Will the challenge succeed?" Charles asked. He directed the question at her, not at the Duke. Not at the room, at her. The specific directed attention of a man who has finally understood where the competence in the room actually lives. "Yes," she said. "The lien is in a legally intermediate state. The evidence of intent is documented. The County Land Commission has ruled against similar structures twice in the past 5 years." She paused. "It will take time, but yes." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man sitting inside a realization that had not finished arriving. "I didn't know," he said. "About the note. About what I didn't know." "I believe you," she said. And she did. It was more complicated than his guilt, and considerably more uncomfortable. Charles had not known because he had never learned to look. And he had never learned to look because she had always been the one looking. And neither of them had ever examined that arrangement long enough to ask whether it was fair. "What do I do?" he said. "To fix it." "You let me file the challenge under my own countersignature authority," she said. "And you stop presenting my work as the estate's general management and start presenting it as what it is." She met his eyes. "That's the beginning. We can discuss the rest later." He nodded. He didn't argue. She had not been certain he wouldn't argue. And his not arguing was its own kind of gift, even if it came later than it should have. He stood and excused himself with the quiet of a man who needed to be alone with something. And Evelyn did not stop him, because some reckonings required privacy. She and the Duke were left alone in the sitting room. She expected him to leave. He had done what she asked, witnessed the conversation, provided the standing that made Whitlock's usual methods unavailable. He had no further obligation to be present, and a man with his particular preference for not occupying spaces unnecessarily would have no reason to stay. He did not leave. He stayed at the far end of the table, turned slightly in his chair toward her, with his hands resting on the arms and his expression doing the thing she had begun to recognize, that quality of attention that was not performing itself. "You knew he'd approach me through the social angle first," he said. "You were a variable he hadn't fully accounted for," she said. "Men like Whitlock don't expect witnesses. They structure their arrangements specifically to avoid them. Having you in the room removed his primary tools." She paused. "He'll regroup," the Duke said. "He will. He has other holding. Other instruments. The Land Commission challenge will stall one mechanism. It won't remove him from the county." She looked at the document case. "I'll need to keep the documentation active. If he attempts a similar arrangement through another party, he will," the Duke said. She looked at him. "You sound certain." "I am certain. I've been watching him operate for 2 years." Something in his expression shifted, not anger, but something adjacent, the specific weight of a person who has spent considerable time holding knowledge they could not immediately act on. The Pemberton revision wasn't the first time he tried to use a legal instrument to acquire land through an intermediary. There was an incident in Aldermore 3 years ago. A family by the name of Creston. He used a debt structure similar to this one. What happened? They sold, he said simply. They didn't have documentation, and they didn't have anyone who could read what he'd done until it was complete. He paused. I was 2 weeks too late to be useful. She looked at him. He was not performing regret. It was not that kind of statement. It was the statement of a man who kept precise records of his own failures, the same way he kept precise records of everything else. The Crestons, she said. Margaret Creston was 61 years old and had managed that farm alone since her husband died, the Duke said. She understood every acre of it, and she lost it because the instrument was buried deep enough in the documentation that no one caught it in time. He met her eyes. You caught it. I had 3 months, she said. She had 3 months too, he said. She didn't know to look. The weight of that sat between them for a moment. Evelyn felt at the specific gravity of a pattern. The recognition that what had almost happened to her was not unique. Had happened before, would happen again to someone else who didn't know to look. Somewhere in this county, maybe soon. How many others, she said. I don't know the full number, he said. At least 4 that I'm aware of in the past 5 years. Possibly more. And the Land Commission has received no formal challenges, he said. Because the people he targeted didn't have documentation, or didn't have standing to present it, or didn't have someone in the room who couldn't be removed. He paused. Until this morning, she understood what he was saying. Not just about her case, about what her case could become if the documentation was presented not as a single-family dispute but as a pattern. If I file the challenge and include the Creston precedent as supporting context, she said slowly, along with whatever documentation you have from the other incidents, it changes the nature of the proceeding, he said. It shifts from a property dispute to an inquiry into a documented practice. Do you have documentation from the other incidents? Not as complete as yours, he said, but enough to establish a pattern when presented alongside it. He looked at her steadily. The question is whether you're willing to expand the scope of what you're filing. She thought about Margaret Creston, 61 years old, who had managed every acre of her farm and lost it because the instrument was buried deep enough that no one caught it in time. Yes, she said, I'm willing. Something settled in his expression. Not relief, he was not a man whose face performed relief, but something that suggested he had answered a question he had been carrying for 2 years and was now somewhat lighter for it. Then we have work to do, he said. We do, she agreed. He pulled his chair closer to the table. She opened the document case. And they began. They worked for 3 hours at that table, building something that had not existed when the morning started, a case that was larger than her estate, larger than her brother's debt, larger than the specific arrangement Whitlock had constructed to trap her. She laid her documentation in sequence, and he cross-referenced it against the dates and details he had been keeping in his own records for 2 years. And the pattern that emerged from the combination was more complete, more damning and more difficult to dismiss than either set of records had been independently. He did not do this for her. That was the thing she kept noticing. He was not managing the process or directing her conclusions or softening the language to be more palatable. He was simply present, organized, precise, contributing what he had and allowing her to do the same. It was the most productive 3 hours she had spent in recent memory, which was not something she had expected to be true, and which she filed alongside several other things she had not expected to be true about Duke Adrian Holloway. At 12:30, Mrs. Connolly appeared in the doorway with the particular expression of a woman who has decided that the people in this room have forgotten that it is lunchtime. "Shall I bring something through?" she asked. Evelyn looked at the Duke. "If it's not inconvenient," he said, directing it at Mrs. Connolly with a gravity that the housekeeper clearly did not expect from a man of his station and visibly appreciated. Mrs. Connolly brought food. They ate without stopping work. which was something Evelyn had never done with another person, the specific, unself-conscious practicality of a shared task that mattered more than the performance of a shared meal, and she noticed it the way she noticed things. Without comment. It was 2 o'clock when she set down her pen and looked at the assembled case spread across the table. "This is enough," she said. "For the commission." "It's more than enough," he said. He was looking at the documents, not at her. "It establishes intent, pattern, and mechanism. A competent commissioner will see what it is immediately. And an incompetent one?" He glanced up. "I know the circuit commissioner. He's not incompetent." She nodded. She began organizing the papers back into their sequence. And he helped, not taking over, but assisting, handing her the pages she reached for before she had to reach for them, which was either attentiveness or the particular unconscious efficiency of a person who had organized a great many documents. And she suspected it was both. "May I ask you something?" she said, without looking up. 2 years ago, when Whitlock approached you about the Pemberton land." She paused. "You refused." She looked up then. "Why did you refuse?" He was quiet for a moment. Because the terms were wrong," he said simply. "The structure would have benefited me financially and damaged the tenants who had worked that land for 2 generations. He looked at her. "I don't make arrangements I believe to be wrong simply because they benefit me. Most people do," she said. "Yes," he said. "They do." She looked at him, this man who had spent 2 years being socially managed and financially pressured and had not adjusted his position, who had watched a woman he did not know handle a situation she should not have had to handle, and had showed up at 9 o'clock with his own records and asked her to show him the documentation. Not because he was rescuing her, but because he had been waiting. She suspected for exactly this kind of case. "Thank you," she said, "for coming this morning. You made the case," he said. "I witnessed it. The witnessing mattered." "Yes," he said. It did. He gathered his coat, because it was past 2 o'clock, and they had done what the morning required, and both of them understood that. But he stopped at the door of the sitting room. "The Land Commission typically schedules hearings within 3 weeks of a filing," he said. "If you need anything before then, additional documentation. Or if Whitlock makes a move before the hearing, I'll send word," she said. He nodded. He looked at her for a moment with those steady gray eyes that didn't perform anything they didn't mean. "You were thorough," he said. "I was," she agreed. "So was he," the Duke said. "And you were still thorough enough." He left. She stood in the sitting room for a long moment after the carriage sounds faded from the drive, looking at the document case on the table and the organized papers and the cold remnants of a working lunch and the particular quality of afternoon light that fell across the table where 2 people had spent 3 hours building something together. Then she sat back down and began drafting the filing. She had work to do, and 3 weeks was not very long. And Lord Whitlock would not be quiet for all of them. She was certain of that much, and she was already preparing for it. The filing went in on a Thursday. Evelyn delivered it herself, not through a solicitor, not through Charles, not through any intermediary who might slow the process or soften the language or suggest, with the best of intentions, that perhaps the wording was a touch aggressive for a woman presenting to a county commission. She walked into the county clerk's office at 9:30 in the morning with the document case under her arm and set the filing on the counter and waited while the clerk read the cover page with the particular expression of a man encountering something he had not expected to encounter that day. "Miss Marlowe," he said slowly, "that's correct. You're filing a formal challenge to a registered lien." He looked up. "Under your own authority. Under my counter-signature authority on the Hartwell Estate accounts," she said, "which is documented on page 3 of the filing, along with the original account registration bearing my father's signature and mine." She paused. "It's all there." He looked at page 3. He looked at the signatures. He looked back at her with an expression she had become familiar with over the past week, the specific recalibration of a man who had formed an assumption about what kind of document this would be and was now adjusting that assumption in real time. "I'll need to log this and forward it to the commissioner's office," he said. "Of course," she said. "I'd appreciate a receipt." He gave her the receipt. She folded it carefully into the inside pocket of her coat, thanked him, and walked back out into the morning. She stood on the steps of the clerk's office for exactly 30 seconds and allowed herself to feel the weight of what had just happened, not triumph, not relief, but something more specific and more durable than either. The particular solidity of a thing that could not be undone. The filing existed now, it was logged, it was real. Then she went home, because there was still work to do, and Whitlock had been quiet for 11 days, and she did not trust his quiet for a moment. She was right not to. The letter arrived the following morning. It was not from Whitlock directly, she had not expected it would be. It came from his solicitor, a man named Aldred Finch, whose firm had offices in the county seat, and whose name she had encountered 3 times in the documentation she had spent the past months assembling. The letter was 3 pages long, and written in the dense, impenetrable language of legal correspondence, specifically designed to require a solicitor to translate. She read it twice without a solicitor. Then she sat very still for a moment. Because what the letter said, beneath the formal language and the procedural citations, was that Whitlock intended to challenge her standing to file. Not the content of the filing, her standing, her authority to bring the case at all. He was not attacking the evidence. He was attacking her right to present it. She had anticipated this. She had prepared for it. She had the account registration, the counter-signature documentation, 10 years of estate records bearing her hand. She had prepared for the legal argument. What she had not fully prepared for was the paragraph on page 2. Near the bottom, where Finch's careful language described a secondary claim. That the counter-signature authority had been granted informally and without proper legal establishment. And that in the absence of formal documentation of her role as estate manager, any instruments bearing her signature were subject to challenge as unauthorized. She read that paragraph 3 times. Then she set the letter down and went to find Charles. He was in the front room, and he read the letter with the slow, progressively paling expression of a man watching a problem he thought was resolved reveal a second layer. "He's saying your signature doesn't count," Charles said. "He's saying the authority behind my signature is contestable," Evelyn said. "It's a technical argument. It's not a strong one, but in front of a commission. Technical arguments don't need to be strong. They need to create enough uncertainty to slow the proceeding." She looked at her brother directly. "I need you to provide a formal statement, a sworn declaration of my role as estate manager, signed and witnessed, confirming that I have operated with your full authority for the past 10 years. Charles looked at the letter, then at her. "That would be public," she said. "It would be publicly documented that you allowed your sister to manage your estate without formal acknowledgement for a decade." She held his gaze without flinching. "I know that's uncomfortable. I need you to do it anyway." He was quiet for a long moment. "How long do I have?" he said. "The commission has scheduled the hearing for 2 weeks from Friday," she said. "I need the declaration before then. Before the end of this week would be better." He nodded slowly. He looked like a man doing something genuinely difficult, not because it required physical courage, but because it required the specific harder kind, the kind that meant acknowledging something you had been successfully, not acknowledging, for a very long time. "I'll have it drafted today," he said. "Thank you," she said. She sent word to the Duke that afternoon. His reply arrived within 2 hours, which was faster than she had expected, and which told her something she filed without comment. He had read Finch's letter, and his response was 3 sentences. The standing argument was anticipated. The declaration from Charles would address it, and he would be present at the hearing. The 4th line, added below the signature, said Whitlock made a similar argument against the Creston family. It failed then too, it will fail again. She read that 4th line twice. Then she put the letter in the document case, with everything else, and went back to work. The 2 weeks before the hearing were the busiest of her life. Not because the preparation was incomplete. The preparation had been complete for weeks. Organized and indexed and cross-referenced, with the particular thoroughness of a woman who understood that her margin for error was considerably smaller than the margin extended to men in the same position. The work was something else. It was the work of maintaining the estate, handling the correspondence, managing the tenant concerns that arrived, regardless of what else was happening. Because the land did not pause for legal proceedings, and the people who depended on it could not wait. She did all of it. She was also, during these 2 weeks, visited. The first visitor was Mrs. Hargrove, the woman who had given her the warning headshake at the Blackthorn Hall dinner. The one who had clearly decided that sitting beside the Iron Duke was a mistake Evelyn would regret. She arrived on a Tuesday afternoon with the precise, purposeful manner of someone who has something to say and has been waiting for an appropriate occasion to say it. "I heard about the filing," Mrs. Hargrove said, sitting across from Evelyn in the front room with her tea going cold in her hands. "The whole county has heard." "I imagine so," Evelyn said. "Lord Whitlock he's not pleased." She paused. "He's been speaking about it. At gatherings about you." Evelyn looked at her. "What is he saying?" "That your understanding of the financial instruments is incomplete. That you've been misled by people with interests opposed to his." She set her teacup down. "That the Duke has influenced your interpretation of events." "Influenced my interpretation," Evelyn repeated. "That's the word he uses, yes." She understood what he was doing. He could not attack the documentation, it was too clean, too organized, too thoroughly cross-referenced. So he was constructing an alternative narrative, one in which the evidence was real, but the woman who found it was not the author of her own understanding. She had been influenced, she had been led. She was not the capable party in this story, but the instrument of someone else's capable party. It was, she had to acknowledge, a sophisticated approach. "What do people believe?" she said. "When he says it, Mrs." Hargrove was quiet for a moment. "Some of them believe it," she said honestly. "Because it's easier to believe that a woman was influenced than that she worked something out herself." She looked at Evelyn with an expression that was more complicated than sympathy, something closer to recognition. "But not everyone who doesn't believe it more than you'd expect." She paused. "Miss Evelyn, the county surveyor you consulted in April, the one who verified your recalculations. He's been talking about the quality of the work, not to be disloyal to Whitlock. I don't think he sees it that way. He simply mentioned to 2 or 3 people that the surveys he reviewed were the most thorough he'd encountered in 15 years of practice." She looked at her directly. "That kind of thing travels." Evelyn absorbed this without visible reaction. Because she had a great deal of practice absorbing things without visible reaction. And because the feeling it produced in her was not something she wanted to perform in front of Mrs. Hargrove. It was something she wanted to sit with quietly, alone when there was time. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "I also want to—" Mrs. Hargrove started again. "I gave you a look that night, at Blackthorn Hall. When you went to sit by him. I noticed wrong too." She said it plainly, without elaboration, with the clean discomfort of a woman who says what she means even when what she means is an admission. "I assumed you didn't know what you were doing. I've been assuming that about you for longer than I should have. And I wanted you to know that I'm aware of it." Evelyn looked at the woman across from her. She had known Mrs. Hargrove for 6 years. They had attended the same gatherings, participated in the same charitable committees, exchanged the same polite seasonal correspondence. She had always found her sensible, if conventional. This version of her direct self-accounting, slightly uncomfortable in the best possible way, was new. "I appreciate you saying so," Evelyn said, and she meant it. The second visitor came 3 days later, and she was entirely unexpected. Her name was Ruth Creston. She was not 61, she was 34. with tired eyes and capable hands and the specific bearing of a woman who has been through something and come out the other side, not unscathed, but upright. She was Margaret Creston's daughter-in-law, and she had heard about the filing from the county clerk's office, where her husband had inquired about the status of their former property. Because apparently some part of him still hoped, she sat across from Evelyn in the same chair, Mrs. Hargrove had occupied 3 days before, and she said, without preamble, he did the same thing to us. I know, Evelyn said. I have the Duke's records. The promissory note was buried in a lease renewal, Ruth said. My mother-in-law signed it because she trusted him. He was always very charming, very patient. He spent months building her confidence in him before he presented the documents. She looked at her hands. She didn't have anyone who could read what he'd done. Her son, my husband, he tried, but the language was designed to be difficult, Evelyn said. Yes. She looked up. Are you including the Creston situation in your filing? As supporting context for a pattern, Evelyn said. If you and your husband are willing to provide a statement, it would significantly strengthen the case. But I want to be clear, it's not required. And I won't include your family's name without your explicit consent. Ruth looked at her for a long moment. We lost everything, she said. The farm my husband's family had worked for 40 years. His mother still isn't. She's not well. She never really recovered from it. She pressed her lips together. If there's a chance that what we went through means something, if it helps stop him from doing it to someone else, then yes. We'll give the statement, thank you, Evelyn said. And this time the feeling behind the words was so large and so specific that she had to look down briefly at her hands to keep her expression where she needed it. Ruth Creston gave the statement the following day. It was 12 pages long, detailed and precise, with dates and document references, and a clarity that suggested she had been holding this account ready for a very long time, waiting only for somewhere to put it. Evelyn added it to the case file. The case file was now, she reflected, considerably more than she had started with. 6 days before the hearing, Whitlock made his move. She had expected something. She had not known what shape it would take. Only that 11 days of quiet and then 2 weeks of social maneuvering meant he was building toward something. Because men like Whitlock did not simply file legal responses and wait. They applied pressure in multiple directions simultaneously. Because pressure from multiple directions was harder to manage than a single point of attack. She found out what he had done from Charles, who came to her study at 7 in the evening, with his coat still on and his face carrying the specific expression of a man who has received bad news and is dreading the delivery of it. Whitlock has called in the Pemberton debt, he said. The secondary note, not the estate lien. The personal debt. Father borrowed from Whitlock's father 12 years ago. A private arrangement never fully settled. Whitlock has the original instrument and he's called it due. He set a letter on her desk. 30 days. She picked up the letter and read it. The figures were real. The instrument was valid. And 30 days was not a coincidence. It was calculated to coincide with the outcome of the commission hearing. Whichever way that outcome fell. If the commission ruled against him, the debt gave him another mechanism. If it ruled for him, the debt was simply additional pressure on a family he was already dismantling. How much, she said, 800 pounds. She set the letter down. She pressed her hands flat on the desk and looked at the wall for a moment, running the figures in her head, not because she needed to run them, but because the familiar discipline of it steadied her. We don't have 800 pounds available in 30 days, she said. No, Charles said. We don't. Does he know that? He knows everything about our accounts, Charles said. And his voice was quiet with something she recognized as shame, not the performative shame of a man making a show of remorse, but the genuine variety, the kind that comes from understanding precisely where your own choices led you. I trusted him with too much too early. The estate finances, the account structures. He had access I shouldn't have given him. She looked at her brother. She felt tired suddenly, in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. "How did he get access?" she said. "He offered to help. After Father died, he said he had connections in the county banking structure. That he could help us manage the transition." He looked at his hands. "He was so helpful. For 2 years he was just helpful," she understood. That was the pattern Ruth Creston had set it. Patient. Charming. Building trust methodically before the instruments appeared. He chose his targets carefully, invested time in them. And by the time the mechanism activated, they felt a loyalty that made them question their own reading of what was happening. She had been spared that particular trap only because she had never trusted him. She had not trusted him because she did not trust men who were that reliably charming. Which was not a sophisticated instinct but a useful one. "I'll contact Duke Holloway," she said. Charles looked up. "Evelyn, not for the money," she said firmly. "I'm not asking him for money. I'm asking him whether he's aware of this instrument and whether it appears in the pattern of Whitlock's documented practice." She held her brother's gaze. "The personal debt may have been inherited legitimately. Or it may be another mechanism. I need to know which before I decide how to respond to it." She sent the message that night. The Duke's reply came the following morning. She read it standing at the hallway table. Still in her morning dress before she had done anything else, because the messenger had arrived early, and Mrs. Connolly had brought the letter up immediately, with the expression of a woman who understood that correspondence from that particular address had a different weight than usual. The letter was longer than his previous ones. He wrote that he was aware of the Pemberton personal debt. It had appeared in his research 2 years ago. And he had been uncertain whether it was legitimate inheritance or a manufactured pressure instrument. He had since found 3 similar structures in his records, all connected to Whitlock's practice of inheriting or acquiring debt instruments from his father's estate and deploying them strategically against families already under financial pressure. He wrote that he believed this specific debt was real, the original instrument was sound, but that the timing of its being called in was clearly deliberate. And that deliberate timing was itself a form of evidence. He wrote one more thing, at the bottom of the page. He wrote, "I have the means to address the £800 directly if it would allow the filing to proceed without this complication. I offer it as a practical matter, not a gift and not an obligation. If it's useful, it's available. If it isn't, disregard it." She read that paragraph 4 times. She sat with it for a long time, not because she didn't know what she felt about it, but because what she felt about it was complicated in a way that required patience to sort through correctly. The offer was practical. He had said so himself, and she believed he meant it. He was not offering it to create obligation, or demonstrate power, or produce the particular debt of gratitude that men sometimes extended to women precisely because it was a form of leverage. He was offering it because the £800 was an obstacle to something they had both decided mattered. And he had the means to remove the obstacle, and he was asking simply whether she wanted it removed. She thought about Margaret Creston, who had no one to ask. She thought about the filing, sitting at the county clerk's office. About Ruth Creston's 12-page statement. About the pattern they had documented, which could only become a matter of record if the hearing happened. She wrote back. She wrote, "Thank you. I accept the practical offer in the practical spirit in which it was made. I will document it as a loan at standard terms and will return it from the estate accounts within 18 months. Please don't argue about the terms. You won't win." She sent it before she changed her mind. His reply came in 3 hours. "Understood. The funds will be with your solicitor by end of week." And I wouldn't argue. You'd be thorough about it. She read that last line and felt something she did not immediately name, because naming it required more composure than she currently had available. And she still had work to do. She folded the letter and put it with the others. The night before the hearing. She could not sleep. This surprised her. She had slept well before the conversation with Whitlock. Well before every difficult thing she had done in the past weeks, she had always been the kind of person whose body understood that rest was necessary and provided it regardless of circumstance. But tonight she lay in the dark with the documents organized and the case prepared and nothing left to arrange. And the absence of preparation left a space that something else moved into. Not fear. She had examined the feeling carefully, and it was not fear. It was the specific disorienting awareness of what tomorrow would be not just a hearing, not just a legal proceeding, but the moment when everything she had built in the private space of her own competence would become public. Acknowledged, entered into the record. The moment when the work of 10 years, the 32 years of being overlooked and undercredited and arranged around like furniture, would be seen by a room full of people who had never thought to look before. She was not afraid of being seen. She tried to name it precisely. She was something she did not have an immediate word for. The feeling of a person standing at the edge of a thing that cannot be walked back from. Not regret, not reluctance. Something closer to the held breath before a door opens. She got up at 5 in the morning and dressed and went to her desk and read through the filing one more time. Not because she needed to, but because the act of reading it steadied her in the way the act of organizing things had always steadied her, the clarity of the documented, the solidity of what could be demonstrated. It was solid. She closed the document case and went downstairs to make tea. Charles was already in the kitchen. He was sitting at the table in the early morning quiet with his hands around a cup. And he looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who had also not slept and was not going to pretend otherwise. "Evelyn," he said. "Charles." She made tea and sat across from him, and they were quiet together for a while. Which was a different kind of quiet than they had ever had before, not the comfortable quiet of people who don't need to speak, but the effortful quiet of people who have said difficult things to each other and are sitting inside the aftermath of that, figuring out where to put it. "I'm going to testify," he said. "If they need me to. Not just the written declaration. In person." She looked at him over her teacup. "I want to say it in front of people," he said. "That you managed it. All of it. That the estate is what it is because of you." He looked uncomfortable in the way of someone doing something genuinely hard. "I should have said it a long time ago. I can't fix that. But I can say it tomorrow in front of the commission and make it part of the record." She set her cup down. "You don't have to. I know I don't have to," he said. "That's why it matters." She looked at her brother, at this man who had spent 32 years looking past her, and who was now, slowly and imperfectly and too late in some ways that could not be repaired, looking directly at her. "All right," she said. "Yes. Come and testify." He nodded. He looked relieved in the specific way of someone who has been carrying the weight of an unspoken thing and has finally set it down. They finished their tea as the sun came up. The commission hearing room was smaller than she had expected. Not the grand formal chamber she had built in her imagination, just a county government room with a long table. A raised platform for the commissioner, chairs for the parties and their representatives, and a dozen or so observers in the back rows who had come because the word had traveled. As Mrs. Hargrove had said, in the way that things travel in counties where everyone knows everyone's name. She saw faces she recognized. Mrs. Hargrove in the third row. The county surveyor, who caught her eye and gave her a small nod. 2 women she knew from the charitable committee, who she had not expected and who she filed away as information about the kind of support that had assembled without her asking for it. She saw Ruth Creston in the back row with her husband beside her. Their eyes met, and Ruth gave her a look that was not a smile and not a nod, but something more direct than either. The look of a woman who has handed someone else her most difficult truth and is watching to see what is done with it. Whitlock was already seated on the opposite side of the room, with Finch beside him, and 2 additional men she didn't recognize, but whose manner identified them as additional legal representation. He was composed, well-dressed. He looked across the room at her when she came in, and she looked back at him. And neither of them performed anything for the other. The Duke was in the back of the room, standing, not sitting. She had not spoken with him since the exchange of letters. He looked at her when she came in the same way he always looked at her, directly, without performance, and she held it for a moment, and then turned to take her seat. Commissioner Hargrove, a different Hargrove, no relation. She had called the room to order at 9 o'clock precisely. "We're here on the matter of a challenge to a registered lien on the Marlowe Estate, Northern Acreage, filed by Miss Evelyn Marlowe under counter-signature authority." He looked at both sides of the room. "I've reviewed the filing. It's thorough." He said the last word in a particular way that told her he had not expected to say it, and that the unexpectedness was itself information he intended to act on. "We'll hear first from the filing party." She stood. She looked at the commissioner. She looked at the room, at Whitlock's composed face, at Ruth Creston's steady eyes, at Charles sitting behind her, at the Duke in the back, who was watching her with the quality of attention she had come to know meant he was paying full attention to everything. She opened the document case. She began to speak. Her voice did not shake. She had not expected it would, but she had wondered. It did not shake because there was nothing uncertain in what she was saying, not a single claim she could not document, not a single figure she could not demonstrate, not a single inference she could not trace back to evidence. She was not arguing. She was presenting a record. That was the difference. That was the thing Whitlock had not understood, had perhaps never understood. About the woman he had decided was safe to overlook. She had not been building an argument. She had been building a record. And now she was reading it into the official proceedings of the County Land Commission, in front of the commissioner and the observers, and the man who had tried to make her disappear quietly into an arrangement she was never supposed to understand. She spoke for 37 minutes. When she finished, the room was very quiet. Commissioner Hargrove looked at her over the top of his documents. He looked at Whitlock. He looked back at her. "Miss Marlowe," he said slowly, "how long have you been managing the Marlowe Estate accounts?" 10 years, she said. "Under whose authority?" "Under the authority of my countersignature registration," she said. "And under the direction of my brother, Charles Marlowe, who is prepared to testify to that effect." Charles stood. He did not wait to be called. He simply stood in the middle of the room, with the particular straightness of a man making himself account for something. And he said, clearly enough for every person in that room to hear, "My sister has managed every significant financial decision made on behalf of the Marlowe Estate for the past 10 years. Every correct decision that estate has made in that period was hers. I am here to say that directly, for the record, because it should have been said a long time ago." The room did not erupt. It did something more significant. It went completely still, in the way rooms go still when something true has been said that everyone in them recognizes as true. Whitlock looked at Charles with an expression that was entirely unreadable. Finch leaned toward his client and said something Evelyn could not hear. Commissioner Hargrove wrote something down, and Evelyn stood at the front of the room with her document case and her 10 years of records and 32 years of patient, unacknowledged competence, and she waited for whatever came next. She was not afraid. She had never been less afraid in her life. Commissioner Hargrove did not rule that day. He said, with the measured cadence of a man who understood the weight of what had been placed before him, that the matter required careful deliberation, that the documentation was substantial and the pattern evidence significant, and that he would issue his ruling within 5 business days. He looked at Whitlock when he said pattern evidence. He looked at Evelyn when he said substantial. Then he closed the session. The room broke apart the way rooms break apart after something significant, not loudly, not with the release of held breath that dramatic moments sometimes produced, but carefully, people moving with the slightly stunned quality of those who have witnessed something they will spend the next week turning over in their minds. Evelyn closed her document case. She was aware of Whitlock on the other side of the room. conferring in a low voice with Finch, his back to her. His posture carrying none of the ease it had held during the session. She was aware of Ruth Creston making her way toward her through the thinning crowd. Her husband a step behind. She was aware of Charles, who had stayed in his seat after his testimony and had not moved since, sitting with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the middle distance, doing something private and necessary inside himself. Ruth reached her first. "You did it," Ruth said, not loudly, not with the performance of relief. Simply a statement. The way a person says a thing they have been waiting a long time to say out loud. "The commissioner hasn't ruled yet," Evelyn said carefully. "He's going to rule for you." Ruth looked at her with the steady certainty of a woman who has spent 3 years thinking about what justice for this specific wrong would look like. "I've been watching Hargrove for 20 minutes. He read your documentation during Finch's arguments. He was reading yours, not listening to theirs." She paused. "He knows what he's looking at." "Then we'll know in 5 days," Evelyn said. Ruth's husband extended his hand. He was a quiet man, with the weathered steadiness of someone who worked land for a living. And his handshake was the kind that meant something. "Whatever he rules," he said, "what you did today putting Margaret's name in the record. The way Evelyn did it that matters to us. It matters a great deal." Evelyn held his gaze. "It should have been in the record 3 years ago," she said. "Yes," he said simply. "It should." They left. And she watched them go, and she let herself feel the full complicated weight of that exchange for exactly as long as it took to feel it. And then she turned back to the room. The Duke was waiting. He had not come forward during the crowd's dispersal. He had stayed near the back wall, with the particular stillness she had come to understand was not coldness but patience. The quality of a man who knew how to wait for the right moment, without filling the waiting with unnecessary movement. He came toward her now, and she noticed, as she noticed things, that he moved through the remaining clusters of people, with an ease that had nothing to do with his rank, and everything to do with the fact that he simply did not perform discomfort. Which meant people unconsciously moved aside, rather than navigating against him. He stopped 2 feet from her. "You were thorough," he said. "You've said that before," she said. "It keeps being true." She looked at him. He looked back. Neither of them said anything for a moment, which was its own kind of conversation. The kind she was beginning to recognize as specific to him, the willingness to let a moment be what it was, without decorating it into something else. 5 days, she said. And then we'll know," he nodded. He glanced toward the door where Whitlock had exited with Finch. Something moved through his expression, not satisfaction, not anger, but the particular weight of a person who has been waiting 2 years for a specific thing to move, and has just watched it begin to move. "He'll appeal," the Duke said, "if Hargrove rules against him." "I know," she said. "It won't change the outcome, but it will extend the timeline. I know that too." She looked at her document case. "I have enough to sustain an appeal. I built the case expecting one." He looked at her with that expression she had catalogued without intending to, the one that was not quite what she had a word for. The one that showed up when she said something he had not expected but recognized immediately as correct. "Of course you did," he said quietly. She picked up her case. "I should get Charles home. He testified today and it took something from him. The good kind of something. But still." His voice stopped her. She turned. "When the ruling comes," he said, "however it falls, I'd like to speak with you. Not about the case." He held her gaze with the directness that had stopped being startling and started being, she realized, the thing she had come to expect from him above all else. "There are things I should have said before now. I kept finding reasons why the timing was wrong." A brief pause. "The timing is never going to be right. I've decided that's not a sufficient reason to keep waiting." She looked at him for a long moment. 5 days, she said. 5 days, he agreed. She walked out of the commission room with her document case and her brother and the residue of 37 minutes of testimony settling around her, like something she had set down after carrying it for a very long time. The morning air outside was cool and direct, and she breathed it in. And she did not look back. The ruling came in 4 days, not 5. She was at her desk when the messenger arrived Thursday morning, 9:47, which she would remember precisely because she had just finished drafting a letter to the county surveyor confirming the corrected boundary records and was reaching for the sealing wax when Mrs. Connolly came to the door with the official envelope and the specific expression she reserved for things that were beyond her ordinary experience. Evelyn set down the sealing wax. She opened the envelope with a letter opener. Not her fingers, because her fingers were not entirely reliable at that moment and she was not going to fumble the paper. She read the ruling. Commissioner Hargrove had ruled in her favor on all 3 primary counts. The lien was declared invalid on the grounds of undisclosed intent. The promissory note was deemed an instrument of financial coercion given the documented pattern of similar instruments against other county families. And Whitlock was formally directed to appear before a secondary inquiry regarding his practice of acquiring and deploying personal debt instruments against families with whom he held simultaneous property negotiations. The secondary inquiry. That was the piece she had not been certain about. That was the piece that moved the case from a single property dispute into something with broader reach. Something that had the authority to examine the pattern across every family it had touched. She sat very still for a moment. Then she did something she had not done in a very long time. She put her face in her hands and she let herself be completely undone for approximately 45 seconds. Which was not elegant and was not composed and was the most honest thing she had done all month. Then she straightened, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and went to find Charles. He was in the front hall when she came down the stairs. And he read her face before she said a word. Whatever she looked like in that moment communicated everything. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. "And there's a secondary inquiry into the pattern. The other families." He sat down on the hall bench. He sat down the way a man sits down when his legs have decided not to continue supporting him for the immediate moment. "God," he said. "Yes," she said. "Will be contacted as part of the inquiry," she said. "It doesn't undo what happened to them, but it puts it in the official record. It establishes what was done to them as a documented wrong rather than just a private loss." She paused. "That matters." Charles looked up at her. He had the face of a man who had been reorganizing his understanding of something for the past 2 weeks and had just reached the final piece. "Evelyn," he said, "I'm sorry." She looked at her brother. "Not just for Whitlock," he said. "Not just for the letter. For all of it. For 10 years of letting you carry this estate, without saying, without acknowledging." He stopped. "I didn't know what I was doing. That's not an excuse. It's just I genuinely didn't know what I was doing. And I should have known, and I didn't look hard enough to find out." She sat down beside him on the bench. They were quiet for a moment together, the way they had been quiet at the kitchen table the morning of the hearing differently than before. With things between them that had been said and could not be unsaid. Which was uncomfortable and also something else. Something that might, with time, become solid. "What happens now?" Charles said. "For the estate. Now we formalize it," she said. "My authority. Not informally, not as a convenience properly. With documentation, the way it should have been from the beginning." She looked at him directly. "I want it in writing, Charles. Not because I don't trust you. Because it should exist regardless of trust. Because the next person who tries something like this needs to encounter a legal document. Not just a family arrangement." "Yes," he said immediately. "Whatever form you need, whatever a solicitor says it should look like." He met her eyes. "You choose the solicitor. I already have one in mind," she said. She sent word to the Duke that afternoon, a brief note. Just the facts of the ruling, written in the same direct register as all their correspondence. His reply arrived within 2 hours. It said, "Hargrove is a good man. The secondary inquiry will take time, but it will be conducted properly. The Creston family should know today if possible." And I believe I said I wanted to speak with you when the ruling came. I meant it. If you're willing, I'll come tomorrow morning. Not at 9 o'clock. 9 o'clock has too many associations with difficult conversations. 10. She read it twice. She wrote back 10 o'clock. And bring your own records for the secondary inquiry. We should begin organizing the supplementary documentation immediately. A pause. Then, before she sealed it, she added one line. I'm also willing to have the other conversation, the one that isn't about the case. She sealed it before she reconsidered. He arrived at 10 o'clock exactly, which she had expected, and he came alone, which she had also expected. And when Mrs. Connolly showed him into the sitting room, the same room where they had worked for 3 hours 6 weeks ago, he looked at the table, which she had not set up with documents this time. And something in his expression registered this. No case files, he observed. Not yet, she said. Sit down, he sat. She sat across from him, which was different from the working arrangement of 6 weeks ago, where they had been side by side over the documents. Sitting across from each other felt different in a way she was aware of and was choosing not to over-examine. You said there were things you should have said before now, she said. I find I prefer directness, as you may have noticed. The corner of his mouth moved, so he agreed. He was quiet for a moment, not the hesitation of someone uncertain, but the deliberateness of someone who has decided to say something correctly rather than quickly. I have not, he said, in recent years been in the habit of finding people I trusted. She waited. That's not self-pity, he said. It's simply accurate. After the Pemberton situation, after what happened with my family, I made a decision, largely unconscious, that the simplest approach was to keep my own counsel and extend my confidence to no one. He met her eyes. It was a workable arrangement. I don't recommend it as a permanent state. What changed it, she said. You sat beside me, he said simply. She looked at him. Not because of some social courage, he said. You sat beside me because it was the last chair and you were tired of standing, and you were not going to let other people's fear make decisions for you. He paused. I had been watching people let other people's fear make their decisions for years, including my own. And you just didn't. You sat down, and you answered my questions honestly, and you didn't perform anything you didn't mean. And I thought, he stopped. What did you think, she said. I thought, this is someone who sees things clearly. He held her gaze. I have spent 2 years wanting to say something to you, and finding reasons why it wasn't the right moment, or the case was still open, or the timing was never going to be right, she said. Yes, he said. I did. Then say it, she said. He looked at her across the table with those gray eyes that had never performed anything they didn't mean. Not once in the entire time she had known him, and he said, I would like, if you're willing, to not be people who only meet when there is a case to build. A pause. I would like to know you outside of documentation. She held his gaze. That is, she said carefully, the most organized declaration of personal interest I have ever encountered. I'm an organized person. You are, she agreed. So am I. She looked at him steadily. I want to say something to you as well. Directly, because I find I've used up every remaining reserve of indirectness I possessed over the past 6 weeks. He waited. I am not, she said, a woman who is well suited to arrangements. I am not well suited to being managed or decided for, or protected from information I'm capable of handling. I spent 32 years in an arrangement of that kind, and what it produced was a letter between 2 ledger books telling me I'd been sold. She paused. I tell you this not as a warning but as information, because you asked about knowing me outside of documentation. And that is the most important thing in the documentation. He did not look away. He did not adjust his expression toward reassurance or produce the particular careful smile that men sometimes produced when a woman said something that required them to decide between authentic engagement and managed response. He said, I didn't revise the Pemberton terms to protect the tenants from information they were capable of handling. I revised them because the original terms were wrong. He met her eyes. I don't manage. Eyewitness. There's a difference. She looked at him. Yes, she said quietly. There is. Mrs. Connolly appeared in the doorway. With tea, at precisely the moment that served as the natural close of the conversation they had just had, as though she possessed the specific social instinct of a woman who had served a household for 19 years and knew, without being told, when a room needed an interruption and when it needed to be left alone. Thank you, Mrs. Connolly, Evelyn said. The housekeeper set the tray down with a look of profound and carefully concealed satisfaction and removed herself from the room. The Duke looked at the tea tray, then at Evelyn. You said you had records for the secondary inquiry. I do, she said. Then perhaps we work first, he said, and continue the other conversation over the tea. That, she said, is an entirely reasonable order of operations. She reached for the document case. The secondary inquiry moved quickly, which surprised her, and then did not surprise her when she understood that Commissioner Hargrove was a man who, having encountered a pattern he found genuinely objectionable, had decided to treat it with the urgency it deserved rather than the pace usually afforded to county administrative proceedings. The Creston situation was formally reviewed within the first week. 3 additional families came forward once the inquiry was publicly announced. The word had traveled, as words traveled in this county, through the particular informal network of people who knew each other's difficulties without necessarily knowing their legal structures. Each family had a version of the same story: the patience, the charm, the helpful manner, the documents that were summarized rather than explained, the mechanism that activated when it was too late to contest. She organized all of it, not because anyone asked her to. Not because it was her case anymore. The commission had its own staff, its own administrative capacity, its own processes for this kind of inquiry. But the families who came forward were not experienced with legal documentation, and the commission staff were competent but stretched. And Evelyn Marlowe had spent 10 years making herself expert in exactly this kind of organized complexity. And she was not going to watch it done poorly when she could do it correctly. She spent 3 weeks working with each family in turn, helping them structure their documentation into the form the inquiry required, explaining the process in plain language rather than legal language, sitting across kitchen tables from women and men who were frightened and exhausted and not entirely certain that whatever they had gathered was enough to matter. She told them it was enough. Every time it was enough. The Duke came to Marlowe House 4 times during those 3 weeks. 3 times to work on inquiry documentation. Once on a Thursday afternoon when she had told him she had a clear morning and nothing that required organizing for the other conversation, which turned out to be less a single conversation than a series of them, overlapping and winding through subjects that had nothing to do with case files or land commissions or legal instruments of any kind. She told him about her father and the 18 months of managing his decline while maintaining the fiction to everyone outside the house that things were orderly. He told her about his brother and the specific grief of watching someone you loved make choices you couldn't stop and couldn't endorse. She told him about the 3 years after her father's death when she had been so immersed in estate management that she had stopped reading entirely, and how strange it had felt to pick up a book again and discover that the part of her that enjoyed things for their own sake had not actually disappeared, only been waiting. He told her about the isolation of the past 2 years and how he had begun, in the absence of company he trusted, to think of himself primarily as a function rather than a person, which was a manageable way to live and also deeply inadequate. She said, "You were doing what I did, making yourself useful because that was the form of existing that felt safest." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I suppose I was. It stops working eventually," she said. "It stopped working the night you sat beside me," he said. "And then you told me you were tired of standing, and I thought what a completely honest thing to say." She looked at him. "It was just true." "Exactly," he said. "It was just true." Something had shifted between them across those weeks gradually. The way shifts between 2 careful people happened. Without announcement, and without the dramatic markers of more performative relationships. They had moved from witness and filing party to colleagues, to she did not have an immediate word for what they were now. Which was itself unusual, because she generally had words for things. What she had instead was the specific awareness of a person who has spent a long time being overlooked and has found, unexpectedly, someone who looks, not to manage her, not to rescue her, simply to look, with the full attention he directed at everything he considered worth attending to. She recognized, happier than she had been in a very long time. Not the performed happiness of a woman behaving well in difficult circumstances. The actual variety, the kind that existed in the present tense, grounded in what was actually true. The ruling on the secondary inquiry came on a Tuesday. Whitlock was assessed a substantial financial penalty on each of the 4 documented cases where financial coercion had been established, and was formally prohibited from entering into property or debt negotiations with county residents without a neutral third-party review of all instruments. The Creston family received a financial settlement. It was not the farm could not be returned. And no legal ruling was going to give back the 3 years of loss and grief and Margaret Creston's health. And everyone involved knew that. But it was something real in a situation that had previously been only loss. And Ruth Creston, when Evelyn told her, sat at her kitchen table and pressed her hands flat on the surface and said nothing for a long moment and then said, very quietly, she'll know. My mother-in-law. I'm going to tell her today and she'll know it mattered. Evelyn drove home from the Creston farm in the late afternoon with the particular weighted quiet of a day that has been completely what it needed to be. When she got home, there was a letter on the hall table. It was from Whitlock. She opened it standing in the hall. It was 3 sentences. The first acknowledged the ruling. The second said that he had consulted with his legal representatives and would not be pursuing further appeal on the primary lien matter or the secondary inquiry findings. The third sentence said, "You were more thorough than I anticipated. I underestimated the scope of your preparation." She read it twice. It was not an apology. She had not expected an apology. And she would not have known what to do with one from him. But it was something an acknowledgement, from a man for whom acknowledgement was itself a form of cost. That she had seen clearly and acted on what she had seen, and done it well enough that he had no remaining angle. She folded the letter. She put it in the document case with everything else. Then she went to her desk and wrote a letter to the Duke, which was the 4th letter she had written him that month that had nothing to do with case files, and which said, among other things, that the inquiry was concluded, and she believed they were finished with the formal portion of the work they had been doing together, and that she found herself in the unusual position of being uncertain what came next, which was not a state she was accustomed to, and which she had decided, unwilling to resolve by retreating back into the familiar shape of making herself useful and waiting for life to arrange itself around her. She said at the end of the letter, "I am told that the chair beside you is still the last one anyone chooses. I find I'm not particularly concerned about that. I've sat in it before. But I wanted to say, and I say it directly, because I have no other remaining mode, that I would like to sit beside you again. Not because it's the last chair available, because I'm choosing it." She sealed it before she changed her mind. She sent it that evening. His reply came the following morning, and it was 4 words. It said, "I'll be there tomorrow," and at the bottom, in the clean economy of a man who did not use words he didn't mean, "I've been hoping you'd choose it." She read it at her desk with the morning light coming through the window and the document case closed on the shelf and nothing on her calendar that required immediate attention. And she felt not triumph, not relief, not the complicated satisfaction of a case concluded, but something quieter and more durable than any of those things. She felt for the first time in 32 years, entirely and precisely like herself. She set the letter with the others. She went downstairs to have breakfast. There was a great deal ahead of her, and she intended to meet it on her own terms. as she had always done, and for the first time, with someone beside her who understood the difference between witnessing and managing, and who had never once tried to be anything other than the former. That, she thought, was the difference that mattered. That was the thing worth choosing. He came at 10 o'clock, as he said he would, not with documents, not with records or cross-references, or anything that belonged to the case they had spent 6 weeks building together. He came with nothing but himself, which was, Evelyn had come to understand, the most Adrian Holloway ever brought to anything he considered genuinely important. The performance was for things that didn't matter. The things that did, he arrived at plainly. Mrs. Connolly showed him in with the expression of a woman who had formed a private opinion about this particular visitor and was keeping it to herself with considerable effort. Evelyn was in the sitting room. She had not set up the table with documents. She had not arranged anything except 2 chairs and the tea things. And she was standing when he came in, because she had found in the past several weeks that she was most herself when she was not performing composure but simply being composed. And there was a difference. "Miss Marlowe," he said. "Your Grace," she said. Then, because they had spent 6 weeks dispensing with unnecessary formality one layer at a time. "Adrian." He stopped just inside the door. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they both knew it. And she watched him register it, the way he registered things completely, without pretending it was less than it was. "Evelyn," he said. She gestured toward the chairs. They sat. Mrs. Connolly poured tea and removed herself from the room with the discretion of a woman who understood that her presence was no longer the point. They were quiet for a moment, not the uncomfortable quiet of 2 people with nothing to say, but the particular settled quiet of 2 people who have said a great many important things and are now sitting inside the aftermath of that, figuring out where it leads. "The inquiry is fully concluded," she said. "Hargrove sent the final administrative notice yesterday." "I know," he said. "He sent me a copy. Because of the supplementary documentation you provided. Because I was a party to the original Pemberton dispute, and he was being thorough," he said. "He's a thorough man." "He is," she agreed. "I appreciate thoroughness." The corner of his mouth moved. "I've noticed." She looked at him across the small table, this man who had shown up at 9 o'clock 6 weeks ago with his own records and his own 2 years of watching, and had never once suggested she needed anything except a witness. This man who had looked at her across a dinner table and asked what she did with the recalculations, and then waited for the real answer. "I want to ask you something," she said. "And I want you to answer it honestly, not helpfully." "Those are sometimes the same thing," he said. "With you usually," she agreed. "But not always." He set down his teacup. "Ask." "The offer you made," she said. "The £800. You said it was practical. You said it wasn't a gift." She held his gaze directly. "Was any part of it something other than practical?" He was quiet for exactly the right length of time, not the pause of someone calculating an answer, but the pause of someone deciding whether to say the true thing or the safer thing. And then deciding, yes, said. "Which part?" "The part where I didn't want anything to stop you," he said. "Not the £800, not Whitlock's pressure. Not your brother's debt. Not anything that could be removed by a practical act." He met her eyes. "It was practical. It was also I wanted the case to succeed because it mattered. And I wanted it to succeed because you were the one building it." A pause. "I'm aware that's 2 different motivations. They're not incompatible," she said. "No," he said, "they're not." She looked at him steadily. "I'll repay it. The full amount within 18 months. I meant what I said in the letter about terms." "I know you did," he said. "I've stopped intending to argue about it." "Good," she said. "Because you would lose." "I know that too," he said. And this time the corner of his mouth moved into something that was fully and unmistakably a smile, which was not a common occurrence on Adrian Holloway's face, and which she had discovered, the specific quality of something that had been genuinely earned rather than socially produced. She felt something shift in the room, not dramatically, not with any of the markers of dramatic shifts.
Just a settling.
The way a house settles when all its load-bearing elements are finally in the right place. Your letter, he said. The one you sent last night. Yes. You said you were choosing the chair. He looked at her. I want to make certain I understand what you mean. Not what would be convenient to assume. What you actually mean. She appreciated this more than she could easily say the refusal to assume. The insistence on clarity, the same quality he brought to legal documents and boundary surveys, and everything else he considered, worth getting exactly right. I mean, she said, that I would like to build something with you. Not because circumstance has placed us in proximity, or because you were useful to my case, or because the timing produced a convenient sentiment. I mean, because I have found in the past 6 weeks that I think better when you're in the room, that I say true things more easily, that I'm less, she paused, searching for the precise word, less armored, and I am a person who has maintained considerable armor for a very long time. And I do not remove it carelessly. She held his gaze. I'm not removing it carelessly. He looked at her for a long moment. Evelyn, he said, I have been a man other people found difficult to be near for the better part of 2 years. I am aware that my manner is direct, she said. Your manner is direct. So is mine. I don't find it difficult. Others aren't in this room, she said. He was quiet. Then I don't know how to do this gracefully. I want to say that clearly. I know how to manage estates and read contracts and organize evidence. I know how to be useful. I don't know how he stopped. Neither do I, she said. I spent 32 years being useful and not much else. I don't have a model for this either. She looked at him. I thought perhaps we could be uncertain about it together. In an organized fashion, he looked at her. Then he laughed. It was not a loud laugh. It was the laugh of a man who had not laughed in a while at something genuine, and was slightly surprised by the sensation, real and unguarded and lasting only a moment, but entirely without performance. She felt it the way you feel warmth when you didn't know you were cold. In an organized fashion, he said. With documentation, she agreed. If necessary. I'll prepare the supplementary files, he said. I'll organize them in order of relevance, she said. They looked at each other, and something between them was both lighter and more serious than it had been 60 seconds ago, which was the particular territory of two careful people deciding to be brave about something together. All right, he said quietly. Then that's what we'll do. The weeks that followed were not simple. She had not expected them to be. Simple was for situations where all the variables were known and all the stakes were low, and her life had never contained much of either. What the weeks contained instead was the specific complicated richness of a life being actively rebuilt on different terms. The formal documentation of her role as estate manager was completed within a fortnight. The solicitor Charles chose at Evelyn's suggestion. As promised was a woman named Helen Prescott, who practiced from an office in the county seat and who read the proposed documentation with the brisk efficiency of someone who had seen a great many informal arrangements finally being formalized and found each one slightly overdue. She added 3 provisions Evelyn hadn't thought of and told her, on the way out, that the cross-referencing in her original land commission filing had been cited in the solicitor's office as a model of organization. Evelyn thanked her. She walked out of Prescott's office with her counter-signature authority formally documented and her role as estate manager legally established for the first time in 10 years. And she stood on the steps for a moment in the sharp morning air and thought, this is what should have existed all along. Not gratitude. Not acknowledgement from people who finally noticed. Just the document, doing what documents do, making something real in a way that couldn't be quietly unmade. She sent a copy to Adrian that afternoon, not because he needed it, but because he was the person she wanted to tell. His reply, which arrived the following morning, said, keep a second copy somewhere separate from the estate files. And congratulations, although this should have existed 10 years ago. She wrote back, you sound like my solicitor. He wrote, she's clearly a sensible woman. She smiled at that. She was doing that more often, smiling at correspondence, which was not something she had previously done, and which Mrs. Connolly observed without comment and with the expression of someone filing information for future reference. The county continued to know things. This was, she had accepted. Simply the nature of counties they knew, they discussed. They formed opinions, and those opinions circulated through the same informal channels that everything circulated through. What the county now knew about Evelyn Marlowe was different from what it had known 6 months ago. And the difference was not subtle. Mrs. Hargrove came to call a second time, and this time brought 2 other women with her, and the conversation they had was not about Whitlock or the commission or the documentary record of anything. It was about an idea Mrs. Hargrove had been developing, which was that the county had 3 times in the past 5 years seen families lose property because they couldn't read the legal instruments they were signing, and that perhaps someone should do something about that. Someone, Evelyn said. Well, said Mrs. Hargrove. Yes. What kind of something, Evelyn said. A resource, Mrs. Hargrove said. Some kind of organized, I don't know what to call it. A place where families could bring contracts they didn't understand, where someone knowledgeable could review them and explain them before the signing. Evelyn looked at the 3 women across from her. Not legal representation, she said slowly. That requires a solicitor. But plain language explanation of what a document does and what it doesn't do. You explained it to the Creston family, one of the other women said. And the Aldwells. And the Fenners. You sat at their kitchen tables, and you told them what the papers said in words they could understand. And you helped them put their cases together. She looked at Evelyn directly. You've been doing it for 2 months. We're suggesting you do it formally. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She thought about Margaret Creston, who had trusted a man who was patient and charming, and signed something she didn't fully understand. She thought about the surveyor who had told 2 or 3 people that her recalculations were the most thorough he'd encountered in 15 years. She thought about what it meant to build a record versus building an argument, and how the record was always more durable. I'll need space, she said. Not here somewhere in the county seat, accessible to people who can't travel easily. I know of a suitable office on Market Street, Mrs. Hargrove said, with the particular tone of a woman who has already investigated this. I'll need documentation standards, Evelyn said. Clear forms that make it easier for families to bring organized information. You designed the inquiry documentation, the second woman said. You could adapt it. I'll need Helen Prescott to review anything that approaches legal territory, Evelyn said. The line between explanation and representation has to be clear. Prescott is already interested, Mrs. Hargrove said. I spoke with her last week. Evelyn looked at the 3 of them. You've already planned most of this, she said. We planned the outline, Mrs. Hargrove said. You plan the structure. That seems to be how you work. She was right. It was how she worked. And the particular feeling the conversation produced in her was different from the feeling of completing the commission filing or winning the inquiry. Those had felt like conclusions. This felt like a beginning. All right, she said. I'll draft a proposal. She told Adrian about it that Thursday. They were in his library. He had one of the more complete estate libraries she had encountered, organized with a logic that she had asked about once, and he had explained. And she had felt the specific recognition of a person encountering an organizational system that made complete sense, which was not a common sensation. She laid out the basic concept while he read over the notes she had drafted. And she watched him do what he always did: read carefully. Follow the logic, register where it was strong and where it needed reinforcement. You'll need funding for the Market Street office, he said. I know. I'm working on a proposal for the county commission. They'll support it, he said. After the inquiry, Hargrove will support anything that prevents repeating it. He set the notes down. I can contribute directly to the initial setup costs. As a practical matter. Not a gift, he said. with the slight preemptive quality of a man who knows he is about to be told terms. A documented contribution to a county service initiative, she said. Acknowledged in the founding records. With terms, he said. Without terms, she said. It's a donation, not a loan. You don't get terms on a donation. He looked at her. That's the most direct thing anyone has ever said to me about my own money. Would you prefer I be indirect about it? No, he said. I would not. He looked at the notes again. I'll contribute. Document it how you see fit. She wrote it down immediately. In the margin of her notes, the way she wrote everything down immediately. In clear language, before the moment passed, he watched her do it. You're documenting my verbal commitment before I leave the room, he said. You said I could document it how I see fit, she said without looking up. This is how I see fit. Of course it is, he said. And there was something in his voice that was warm and precise at the same time. The specific warmth of someone who has found a person whose particular way of being in the world fits next to their own. She finished writing and looked up and found him watching her with an expression she had catalogued without intending to. The one that showed up when she said something he hadn't expected and recognized immediately as right. She held his gaze. Yes, I told you. When we spoke about this, that I didn't have a model for what we were doing, she said. I want to amend that, he waited. I have a model, she said. It's the only model I trust, because I've seen it work and I know what it looks like in practice. Two people working toward something together, each contributing what they're actually good at. Not managing each other, not performing confidence they don't have or certainty they haven't earned. She looked at him steadily. Witnessing. The way you witness, the way you stood in that commission room and did not speak until it was time to speak and did not step forward until it was time to step forward. She paused. That is the model. And I want it for this. She held his gaze for one moment longer. For everything. The room was entirely quiet. He looked at her the way he had looked at her that first night across the dinner table, when she'd mentioned the boundary surveys, and he had gone still in the specific way of someone encountering something they had been looking for, without knowing they were looking with his full attention. Without performance, without anything between what he felt and the expression of it. He reached across the table and took her hand, not with the dramatic intention of a romantic gesture. The way a person reaches for something they are certain of steadily. Without hesitation, the way you reach for something when you already know it will be there. Everything, he said. She looked down at their hands on the table, at his grip in her own, and she felt something she had no immediate word for settle into place, not like an ending, but like a foundation. The kind of thing that doesn't make noise when it arrives, but that everything afterward is built on. Then that's agreed, she said, with documentation. If necessary, he said. I'll prepare the files, she said. The office on Market Street opened in the spring. It was a modest space, 3 rooms, a reception area. 2 consultation rooms where families could sit with someone who would read their documents plainly and explain in ordinary language what the papers did and what they didn't do, and what questions to ask before signing anything. Helen Prescott came every Tuesday. Evelyn came every day the first month, and then 3 days a week as the work found its rhythm and the staff she had recruited learned the documentation standards she had built. The county surveyor donated his time on alternate Thursdays, reviewing any land descriptions or boundary language that families brought in. Mrs. Hargrove organized a small advisory committee that met monthly. Ruth Creston's husband, who turned out to have a facility for plain language explanation that rivaled Evelyn's own, became one of the volunteer consultants within the first 6 weeks. She had not anticipated Ruth's husband. She had not anticipated several things. She found, becoming more willing to be surprised, which was its own kind of shift, not the loss of thoroughness, but the addition of a tolerance for the good things that arrived without being planned. Adrian came to the office once in the first month. Not to work, but simply to see it. He walked through the 3 rooms with the same attending quality he brought to everything. And he looked at the documentation standards she had mounted on the consultation room walls, the plain language checklist she had developed for families reviewing contracts, and he was quiet for a moment. "You designed these in the margins of your commission," he said. "I saw you drafting them. I've been thinking about them for longer than that," she said. He looked at the checklist on the wall. "Margaret Creston would have had this," he said quietly. "If this had existed." "Yes," she said. "She would have." He turned to her. "That's what this is for. That's what this is for," she agreed. He looked at her with the expression she had finally named. Somewhere in the weeks of Thursday conversations and shared documentation and letters that had stopped being about cases and started being about everything else. The expression was simply, "I see you," not what you've done or what you can produce or what role you serve. You. She had spent 32 years not being seen. She understood now what it felt like. It felt like standing on solid ground. The spring gathering at Aldermore Hall was the first social occasion of that kind she had attended since the Blackthorn Ball dinner 6 months before. She had not planned to attend. It was Adrian who suggested it, not as a test or a statement, but because he had received the invitation and found that his first thought was that he'd rather go if she would come with him. And he had said so directly, because that was how he said things. She had agreed for the same reason. The hall was full when they arrived. The same county faces she had navigated for years. The same careful social choreography of rank and familiarity. She felt it differently now than she had 6 months ago, not as a system she was managing from the outside, but as a landscape she moved through with her own weight and her own direction. She wore the dark blue gown, the one Charles had once said made her look severe. She no longer considered that an objection. People noticed them when they came in. That was simply true, and she didn't bother pretending otherwise. The county had spent 6 months watching and discussing and reforming its collective opinion, and the assembled room was doing what rooms did, registering, assessing, recalibrating. She let them look. She had learned somewhere in the past 6 months that being looked at and being defined by what people saw were 2 entirely different things, and that only one of them was in her control. Mrs. Hargrove found her within 10 minutes and greeted her with the particular warmth of a woman who has revised a long-standing opinion and is still slightly awed by what it took. "You look well," she said. "I am well," Evelyn said. Not as a pleasantry, as a fact. Commissioner Hargrove made his way across the room to tell her, with the formal satisfaction of a man who had done something he was proud of, that the inquiry documentation had been forwarded to 2 neighboring counties as a model for their own commission processes. The county surveyor told her that 3 families from the adjacent district had contacted the Market Street office after hearing about it through his professional network. Ruth Creston, who was there with her husband the first time. She told Evelyn quietly. They had attended a gathering like this since before the farm was lost. Because gatherings had felt like a thing that belonged to people with something to celebrate, found her near the far window and held her hand for a moment without saying anything, which was its own kind of language. And through all of it, Adrian was beside her, not in front of her directing the conversations, not behind her managing the outcomes, beside her, in the specific way of a person who has decided that beside is exactly where they intend to be, and who has enough confidence in the decision not to perform it. He spoke when he had something to say. He was quiet when he didn't. He watched the room with the same attending quality he brought to everything. And once or twice their eyes met across a conversation, and she felt the particular recognition of 2 people who are, in any given moment, thinking approximately the same thing and knowing that about each other. It was late in the evening when they found themselves near the long dining table, the same table, or one very like it, where she had sat beside him 6 months ago and changed the entire direction of her life by being tired of standing. The chairs around the table were largely empty now. the guests having moved to other rooms, other conversations. There were 2 chairs remaining at the near end, side by side. He looked at the chairs. She looked at them. There are other seats, he said. In the other room, she agreed. This was the table, he said. Not exactly, but the same room. He looked at her. Not with the social assessment he'd directed at her that first night. The look of a man encountering something unexpected and trying to categorize it. With the look she had come to know as his actual face, the one that didn't perform anything it didn't mean. That registered everything it felt, that had been waiting. She thought for a long time for somewhere to be exactly what it was. Miss Marlowe, he said. Formal, deliberate, not because they had returned to formality, but because some moments deserved the weight of their original words. Your Grace, she said, matching it. Will you sit beside me? She looked at the chair. She looked at him. She thought about the woman who had sat down in that chair 6 months ago, tired, furious, carrying a letter that had sold her future. With nothing but her own thorough mind and her 32 years of unacknowledged competence and the specific, clarifying anger of someone who has finally run out of patience for being invisible. That woman had sat down because it was the last chair available. Because she had nowhere else to go. That was not why she was sitting down now. She sat. The chair was exactly as she remembered. The room was warm. The evening sounds of the gathering moved around them from the other room's voices. Music, the particular comfortable noise of people engaged in their lives. Adrian sat beside her. Their shoulders were almost touching. Not quite. The precise distance of 2 people who are close enough that the distance itself is a choice. You sat beside me, he said quietly, because it was the last chair. Yes, she said. And now? She turned to look at him. At this man who had shown up at 9 o'clock with his records and his 2 years of watching, and had never once suggested she needed to be anything other than what she was. This man who had called her thorough and meant it as the highest possible thing. This man who had looked at her across dinner tables and commission rooms and library tables covered in documentation, and had never once looked past her at whatever was more convenient to see. Now, she said, there are other chairs. He looked at her. And I chose this one, she said. I choose it. Completely. On purpose, with full knowledge of what I'm choosing. She held his gaze with the directness she had practiced for 32 years, and only recently understood was her greatest strength. That is the difference between then and now. That is the only difference that matters. He reached for her hand. The way he had reached for it in the library, steadily. Without hesitation, the way you reach for something when you already know it will be there. She let him take it. Around them the evening continued. The music from the other room drifted through the open doors. The gathered county went on being itself, knowing things, discussing things, forming opinions that would circulate through all the informal channels that opinions circulated through. Let them look, she thought. Let them see exactly what this is. She had spent 32 years making herself small. She had spent 32 years folding herself into the shape that other people's expectations required. Managing estates without credit, solving crises without acknowledgement. Being the furniture in every room she walked into. She was not doing that anymore. She was the woman who had read a letter between 2 ledger books and understood what it meant and chosen to act on that understanding. She was the woman who had sat down beside the most feared man in the room because she was tired of standing. She was the woman who had built a case from 3 months of careful work and presented it in a county commission room until the right things were on the record and the people who had been quietly harmed had somewhere to put the truth of what had happened to them. She was the woman who had built an office on Market Street so that the next Margaret Creston would have somewhere to go before it was too late. She was the woman who had chosen the chair beside Adrian Holloway not because it was the last one left, not because circumstance had placed her there, but because she had decided, on her own terms and in full knowledge of what she was deciding, that beside him was exactly where she wanted to be. That was who she was, not who someone had decided she was. Not who the county had always assumed. Not the quiet Marlowe sister. Not the unremarkable spinster, not the useful woman that no one thought to credit. Herself, entirely, precisely, and without apology. His hand was warm around hers. The evening stretched ahead of them this evening. And all the evenings that would come after it, full of documentation and difficult cases and kitchen tables and county offices and two people who had found, unexpectedly and against considerable odds, someone who looked at them directly without looking past them. She would take all of it. She intended to be thorough about it. That she had always known was how the best things were built, not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in careful, patient, meticulous work, in showing up, in reading every page, in never assuming the summary was the whole story, in choosing, every day, with full knowledge, on your own terms. She tightened her hand around his. She had made her choice, and she was keeping it.